lucky to have two speakers tonight to do their talks, and I'm just going to briefly talk about each one and introduce them a little bit. So, first speaker tonight is Dave Sr. So from pitching in Silicon Valley to visiting startups in the EU, David has collected a global understanding of the entrepreneurial space. Today he's a business strategist at Playground Inc., helping tech startups to think like big business and big businesses to think like startups. And the topic today for Dave is fitting design into Agile development. The second speaker tonight will be Varun Vachar. Varun's Rangle.io's expert on fusing design and development. He's an expert in CSS front-end and design, and his topic today is don't fight it, everything will be fine. So with that, I would like to pass along to Dave, and welcome to the talk.
Thank you so much for having me today. Playground Inc. is right around the corner. We're actually in the building right beside here, so it wasn't very hard for me to get here tonight. And Playground is a 6-year-old user experience design agency. We're basically a family of people. We're about 20 people who are all really multidisciplinary, which is something that you really have to be when you're thinking about being a designer, right? When you're a UX designer, you're doing a little bit of everything. You're interfacing with potentially the person who owns the product, potentially the person who's running the project, the person responsible for the metrics. So you really have to kind of be a jack of all trades, right? And letting design expose you to a bunch of topics. And those are the types of people we work with, and those are the type of people we look for. And we have a small team on purpose because it's really hard to find really great people. I'm sure the people here at Rangle kind of get that too. So yeah, our experience, we've kind of made a ton of stuff in the last 6 years, and we've done it using a ton of different processes, right? I'm sure you guys all read about different processes like Lean and Agile and continuous delivery and all these things. And a lot of these things are sort of viewed through the lens of just pure development a lot of the time, or pure, I'm a startup and I need to make this product. But these processes kind of have to be applied into other disciplines, right? Disciplines like creating something within an organization, or refreshing something, or changing a product, or iterating, or all those things that you're supposed to enable. But how does design sort of fit into that? And as designers, we're often just waiting around to hear feedback, right? We're kind of like working with people, or waiting around to hear feedback. And we've kind of, over the last little while, kind of developed a competency to be able to learn and adapt and work with teams like that. This is sort of our first claim to fame. We designed, came up with, and implemented the first responsive website built on WordPress, built on a CMS ever. And it was for a company here in Toronto called the Toronto Standard. I don't know if you remember, they were a short-lived blog, but this really was how we kind of grew our business, is just coming up with solutions to problems. And this wasn't like, oh, let's try responsive techniques, or oh, let's kind of take an agile approach to solving a problem. It was kind of like we had to work within our means to come up with a solution. And those are the types of things you can solve with agile design, is coming up with processes let you do cool things like that. We went and we did all sorts of work in publishing, working with companies like Course Entertainment and Rogers Media on their main television websites is sort of what we did for a long time. And fortunately won a couple of awards for some of that work, which is kind of cool too. But we've had to learn a lot in the process, and what I'm going to do is take you through a project we recently completed, which is called Sportsnet. Don't know if you guys know Sportsnet. If you're a Blue Jays fan right now, I'm sure you're tuning in all the time to Sportsnet. You should probably be watching right now. Sportsnet was really interesting. Sportsnet was an amazing brand. They were doing a ton of new things. They had bought the rights to the NHL. They owned the Blue Jays. They had this entire media monopoly on what matters to Toronto sports fans, what matters to Canadian sports fans. And they wanted to redesign something. They wanted to redesign their core mobile experiences in tablet and in mobile. Right? So they had a really huge problem. TSN's eating their lunch in mobile. The Score, ESPN, Bleacher Report, people from all over the world are competing in this space. And they own this great brand, they own all this great content, but they just weren't competing. And they weren't competing because their platform wasn't there. They weren't meeting their customers' expectations. So we ended up collaborating to build this. And this is kind of like a view of everything sports could be and everything sports means, and how do you get that translated to an experience. So when we came in, they were at the very beginning of something. They wanted to redevelop their entire platform. And I'm sure a lot of the developers who work at Rangle are kind of familiar with this, is that you're upfront engineering on a project. You've developed your methodology, you might have some agile build teams, and the whole beginning part of a project is kind of like this infrastructure enabling sort of thing. But at a certain point, you hit the product and customer enabling engineering, where that engineering about the finesse on the front end, what this thing looks like, what it's eventually going to deliver to the end user, starts to matter more and more. And as you progress through a project, all that stuff continues to matter. We're not talking about just pure customer validation or lean. I'm talking about like when you get into the nitty-gritty of implementation, to build the base, and then you got to build customer experiences on top of that. And that was very true for Sportsnet. They had to figure out all their stats engines, they had to figure out all their update engines, they had to figure out their publishing pipeline, how it integrates with everything that they do there. So they're doing all this engineering, and then we come in, day one on a project, and they are just starting to think about how this relates to the customer. And so this is what it kind of looked like at Rogers and our team on day one. We were the UX people, we were interfacing with product people, we interfaced with the dev people, and we all kind of got together sometimes. And that worked. I know, like we were kind of like trying to figure it out, feel out the process, and seeing how it works, because every team's a little bit different. But then it didn't work, and we kind of like reached a point where we couldn't just try to grok deliverables, figure out what we're going to do, and then deliver them. So we had to come up with this concept of integrating the teams, and we called it a minimum viable design process. So that had to do with breaking down what this thing was going to look like into several different areas so that we could realign a team, right? So, you might think about a product from a visionary standpoint. You might think about a product from what is this thing going to look and feel like? How do we do it? And then so how do you get design started on a project that big? Like how do you get enough things in place at the very beginning so that you can continue to design and iterate and do all the things that make Agile great? Like, how do you do that? Because everyone wants to build things. Everyone's waiting for the designers to get you specifications, to get you new things. How do you even start design? How do you even start building customer views without, like, knowing anything? So that's what minimal viable design is about. So, like, you want to create basically a loose system where you're figuring out very important things very early. Stuff like the vision of the app, what the thing's going to feel like, right? And getting buy-in from enough people on the team. Because design's kind of waterfall sometimes. Buying on the vision, you might not get there. You want to figure out stuff like your grids, your typography systems. So they're very, very early things that can start applying in multiple areas of the app. Then interaction principles. You continue to build out from there, and it kind of spirals out from there. So that had to do with us really rebuilding the teams to look a lot more like an Agile design team, right? So you had people responsible for different parts of the application. Right? You have people responsible for maybe the score feeds, maybe the team pages, maybe things like that in the process. And they're all working together, they're all working in different directions, and they're all doing different things. We're giving them this sort of platform, this base layer of information about what the design is going to be at the very beginning, and then iterating with each individual team through their section, using the vision of the app to kind of guide it. And that's what it sort of looked like on day 14 and of the project. So now we had all these individual build teams all doing their own thing. We had a designer on the team, you have your product owner who's owning a particular section of that, and you have sort of the developers who are supporting the action, putting these things to life. But that's not exactly the best way to do it either. So what we discovered was that everyone's kind of moving in a separate direction. You want to move fast, you want to be able to do this, but these are complex applications. These have multiple views and multiple teams. So what we started to have to do was think about this across and deep, right? So every team here had their product owner, they had their developer, but they weren't acting in sort of this guilds thing, right? So like every team is sort of a guild, right? You have people who own product who all need to be collaborating and all need to be talking to each other. You have people who own design who need to be talking to each other. And you have people who are actually building the product that need to be talking to each other. And this wasn't really a new concept. This is a concept we borrowed from Spotify. And Spotify actually does some great blogging and great writing about this sort of stuff. But they talk about enabling design and enabling great things to happen, but how do you keep that all cohesive? And that's about like, if you have multiple designers on the project, you have multiple people responsible for different things, all those teams need to go both horizontal and vertical. Right? So all the designers are always getting together and someone's keeping the vision, everyone's collaborating, everyone's saying this is what things should look like, this is unified, this is a good application of what we thought we were going to do in the style guide, this is a great new idea we should use in other sections of the application. And that way you're not spinning your cycles waiting for the next delivery and be like, oh, that's a good idea, and that's a good idea, and that's a good idea, but like they're all different ideas and now you're not creating something holistic. Right? So now you have a team of designers who are going right across the top. We call these skill teams. Right? And then you have a team of developers who's going right through the middle, right? And they're your developer skill teams. They're starting to see, what do I have to do? What can I learn from each other from implementing previous design, previous interaction principles? And you have the product ownership team that's really working all together all the sections of the app start getting this sort of cohesive sort of feel about them. And that's when you can start getting into cadence and rhythm, and really understanding velocity, really getting all the juice out of the Agile process that you really want. But no one really talks about how design works in Agile, because design's traditionally pretty waterfall, right? You wait for something, you see it, designers wait around again, they get the implementation, they say, no, that's right, no, that's wrong. Then the data team kind of looks at it and they say, oh, but it's doing the right thing, and the designer's like, oh no, but this is so ugly. So this way you're kind of continuing to take that Agile process, continue to allow ownership of different pieces of the application, but encouraging collaboration across units and across responsibilities with the actual guilds, the actual skills themselves. And this was sort of like the end result of that process. And this is actually a design artifact. This is something we build. So we go and we create After Effects stuff, Atomic stuff. We take the designs and we actually create these specifications. And these act as spec documents for the actual teams themselves. So every design team might be augmented with video resources or interactive resources or prototyping resources. So you can actually build these things so that you can meet user expectations. These things are invaluable. And you'd be surprised how quickly you can get a visual artist or a motion graphics artist to produce a mock-up like this, and how long it takes to end up implementing, right? So like this type of process of creating a design, bringing it to life, might take a week, right? And then you're seeing a bunch of different parts of the application right now. It might take a week to isolate, design, build, and do it. But then the actual build process might take 2 weeks to a month or whatever. And that allows you to sort of provide the specifications, continue to iterate, continue to do really great things, but like providing real world examples of how these things work. And like you can't, say enough how much prototyping in the design process is important. The biggest kind of failure point we've identified with prototyping in design is that it starts looking like waterfall. You're like, a designer hands it off to a developer. The developer then goes and kind of builds it half-assed, and like it takes forever, and then they get it back, and by then they have a new idea, right? So you need to be able to work with tools that are going to allow you to make that progress pretty quickly. And this is sort of the process that kind of lets you get there. And we call this our collaborative process, but it is how you fit yourself into sort of any process, right? If they're using Agile, great. If they're using Lean, great. But like what we've done is we've had to work with a variety of teams using crazy different project management software sometimes, using all sorts of different tools. But what it comes down to is like really people. And these like are kind of like the 4 tenets of how we fit into any sort of a process or any Agile process. It just has to do with building trust, really. That's like one of the most important things. But trust is built by getting together a lot. So we refuse to go away. We're kind of annoying. We're always getting together, so communicating constantly. You might be participating in daily Scrum stand-ups, and then we have official design meetings with the design guild across the organization. Where we're getting together, talking with the project owners, talking with the product owners, and really talking all the time. Wednesday we're figuring out what the cadence was of the things we're supposed to deliver. Friday, let's see what was actually delivered, evaluate, see what our next steps are. Work in progress. Never be afraid to show work in progress. That's probably not a problem for a lot of you people on the Rangle team. You're used to that continuous delivery sort of system. But you'd be surprised how new that is to a lot of corporate people. Like they don't want to show you what they aren't finished yet. That's super important in design too, right? Like as designers, we're kind of always anxious and nervous, and we don't want to necessarily present things that we don't think are fully baked. That's super important. The third part here, it's kind of the most important, is stakeholder engagement. With us, we get to design a lot of big platforms for a lot of kind of crazy people who are, whose jobs are kind of riding on this. If you don't have access to those people, if they are not product owners on your team, the project's pretty much destined for failure. You're going to do all these Agile processes, you're going to do all these great things, trying to get velocity, trying to figure out all this stuff, but then someone's just going to see it and tell you to go fix something, or tell you to go change something, or tell you that it's not meeting specifications. When it comes to design, you really need the people who are going to be running the product there, seeing the outputs of your Agile process and involved in the Agile process. Otherwise, you're just going to get to a point where you hit a roadblock. And the last is velocity. Because this is a people project, people-based project, getting together a lot, there's like no arguments about did we accomplish enough, are we on track? You're kind of all making those decisions together. All the designers are getting together, knowing what they have to do. You're assessing how they work with their individual teams, and you're continuing to go from there. So really, this isn't about documentation, it's not about anything like that, it's about like figuring out what the minimum starting point for your project is. Is that the interaction principles? Is that the grid system? Is that the typography? Give people enough information that they can start on their design and then go from there. And this is sort of like what our process looks like visualized. Like you kind of start any new design idea with your strategy about what it's going to be. you go through a design process where you're prototyping things, you're throwing things out, you're designing a new thing, you're throwing it out, you're testing it, see if it's meeting the requirements, seeing if it's testing well with users. And then if it's good, you codify a document, because that's what designers should be doing. I'm sure all of you have produced red line documents before where you have all the specs about how all these things work. It's kind of annoying, but super important part of the process. And then throwing out bad ideas. And never being able to like kind of revisit those bad ideas is also sort of important too. And that's really, everything we know right now about doing agile design. Design is hard, right? Design is subjective, but design is also measurable. Design can also be part of the development process. So, we're learning a lot every day, every time we work with someone new, every time we try a new process, every time we work into a process that's happening in a business. But we find that the real tenets of Agile come down to that communication level. And it comes down to figuring out what can we do right now to provide people with the design tools to make good decisions in their teams going forward. And that's what the upfront work is to really kick off Agile design. So that's all I really got. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.
Do you have a few minutes for any questions?
Yeah, any questions? Absolutely.
I was wondering how many build teams you have going at a time. You had 3 kind of in your graphic,
So it really depends. Sometimes our teams are asked to do a lot. We're asked to be the whole team, right? We're asked to be the designer, the product owner, the project manager, all the developers underneath it. And in that case, we have about 4 build teams internally to Playground that can do that. And then other models is where we're kind of in a team augmentation model, where we use our sort of UX expertise or product management expertise to come in and augment a current existing team. And in which case, that kind of just scales with the number of people we can assign to particular projects.
And actually, one more question, it would be nice. At the end of the project, do you have like a phase to like bring everything together, or like review it as a whole across all the teams? Like, or is it just...
That's constantly happening.
Okay.
So that's the whole point of setting up your guilds, really, those skill teams that happen across the different levels there, because if you wait to the end to unify, that's like really not a good time to unify. It's kind of annoying. That's what makes the last 10% the hardest a lot of the time. And you just kind of want to make that predictable. So we're constantly reassessing that everything's good. You'd be surprised what you can accomplish with 2 designers who are on the same page. Some of the biggest experiences in the world, like Time Magazine, for example, were built with 1 designer and 1 developer prototyping the whole thing and then giving it to the content has to be, right? So you'd be surprised what you can accomplish with small teams. And then it just comes down to communication. You shouldn't wait to unify. Unification should be a thing that if you get your sort of design standards right up front during that initial process, those things should be emergent and evolving and iterating together. Another question?
Did you, when you're working with Sportsnet, which is Rogers, they're probably largely waterfall based, I'm assuming, the way you develop things. Did you find yourself kind of reverting back to that often, or what do you do to convince them to kind of see the right way?
So at the very beginning, it was very waterfall. Starting in day 1, we're kind of like, yeah, we'll go off, we'll do these things, and we'll do that. I think there's a lot of our job is really communication and client education, right? So it's like figuring out how to make things more predictable to them instead of less predictable. So waterfall's a really easy methodology to fall back on to make things more predictable. It also allows project managers to be less savvy. It allows product owners to be kind of less involved. They can kind of wait and check in and do those types of things. And people do have the tendency to fall into sort of easy stuff, right? Everyone who went to university took a project management class and they saw a Gantt chart once, right? And it's really easy to understand. Agile means people are kind of embracing uncertainty a little bit. And what you kind of have to do is the developers want to work that way, right? The team wants to work that way. These companies want to work faster and they want to show progress and they want to do these things. And you kind of continue to hit them with it, right? You have to continue moving faster than them, right? If you're a really good agency, you make every dollar spent worth $10 back to the company, right? And that should be your goal. And so, hopefully, fortunately for us, when people come to work with Playground, they want to work with Playground because we made a lot of things really quickly. And we've, for example, that Sportsnet project, complete re-engineer, complete new interfaces, everything, launched from the ground up. was a 6-month project. And that's like a primary customer-facing touch point for them. You like watch the Blue Jay game, they're advertising all day long, right? And
the product guy, like they attend daily meetings.
Yeah, so like you're instituting Scrum. Like fortunately for us, Rogers was actually really embracing Agile methodology at the time. They had a lot of management changes pretty recently, if you guys are like following the news. But they really want to move that. And I believe a lot of companies want to move like that. I think it's the middle of the road projects that tend to move like waterfall due to sort of the unsavviness of the product owners, the kind of like the importance of the initiative. I think as those things sort of scale within an organization, they're evaluating who's the best person to put on this project. What processes are they going to enable to do it, right? And so you know, in my opinion, you know, it's not as hard of a problem as it used to be.
How has testing changed under the Agile?
Okay, sorry, I'm like hard of hearing, so.
Okay. How has testing changed under like the Agile methodology for your company?
I'm gonna have to come through.
So how
does testing
change?
change?
How hard is it to change something in a Agile methodology?
How hard is it to change something?
How has it changed?
How has testing changed?
Oh, so testing is really interesting. So we try to make our projects end at least have a deliverable that's customer facing, or at least beta customer facing, well before the end of a project. So like when you get to sort of, let's say it's a 6-month project, by month 4 you want to have something that you can test. And then those last 2 months are really to refine, to iterate, to get it like really, really nice and going. So I think the trick to testing in Agile is like, and continuous delivery in general, is to build into your project kind of like this deliverable date and then this second deliverable date.
Well, sir, wait a second. But what about like actually getting it to production or whatever like sooner? Because even if you have a 6-month project, you give yourself like a month worth of testing. Like, that's not really Agile, right?
No, so like it's in the market, right? Like 4 months in, you're releasing it.
Okay.
And then you're iterating, you're changing, you're gathering the data, you kind of take a week off kind of thing. You like let like the data get statistically relevant. You find out what problems users are really having, and you kind of re-engage and start that Agile process all over.
So how would you, I guess this might be a little bit of a question for how you handle sales, but when you're dealing with like a proposal for Rogers, like you're either presupposing the strategy, so you have to do a little bit of work ahead of time, or you're like how have you kind of like had to balance that?
We kind of like
kind of an open project. It's just holistically speaking.
Yeah.
It's very.
So
very
it's hard, right? So like you know, there like we got invited to pitch on this, you know, type of thing. There was other people who were pitching on it. And we kind of had to dream about like what would be the ideal situation. But we knew sort of what initiatives they had on their go, right? Like that was all stuff we could discern, right? It's like, oh, you're doing all sorts of new stuff with the NHL. You're doing all sorts of new stuff with the Blue Jays. Your current app is doing this. Here are who your competitors are. What has been the social strategy around really great video experiences right now? What has been the social strategy or the inbound strategy of other really great social video apps? What did Yahoo do? What did ESPN do? Right, and you're kind of distilling that down into a proposal that is digestible, you know, and you're kind of going in there and asking them to like dream about competing with the best people in the world, and that's what they want to do. That's how they see themselves. And I think second to that, you know, when it comes to sales, it's all about like being a person. You know, like people want to work with good people. We don't have salespeople at Playground. I'm the closest thing we have to a salesperson, because like. It's like, and salespeople aren't a bad thing. It's just that we're, like as an agency, it's like we sell creative vision a lot of the time, right? And when you think about like, we watch Mad Men, which is like cliche, but like it's usually the creative director who's going and pitching those types of things. And because we've been so involved in the design process, it's all about like kind of pitching vision and pitching the ability of the people who are going to work on this to help you fulfill the vision that we're kind of augmenting for you.
So you already kind of like evaluated the strategy already. You're kind of saying, oh,
so
we're giving you an app, we're giving you this.
Evaluating the strategy is like, you know, that's like 9/10 of like the job of knowing what to design, right? You know, and like, so you want to come in and like know that, hey, what would I do if I had this tool set to work with? You know, like what are the things that I know are goals for your organization? you know, and those are often aligned in whatever the RFP or the brief or whatever they're sending over to you anyways. But, you know, really trying to figure out what's up. And I mean, you know, your job as like a vendor to someone who's going to vouch for you is to get that person promoted, right? So if they believe you're the person who can get them promoted, they'll have no problem.
So I'm curious, you have a couple contracts. You have one, you're competing for Sportsnet, for instance. You have an Agile contract that is, hey, we'll get X accomplished sometime. And you have a fixed bid contract being like, hey, we'll have X accomplished by this time. How do you fight that?
So everything ends up being fixed bid. That's how we fight it. We just tell, like, we know how long it's going to be. We charge for our time, not for our deliverables. But we say, here's the deliverables you're going to get at the end of this project. If we run long, that's our bad on estimation. You know, and we kind of just like work through that, and then we have like sort of clauses that say like, if scope is changing dramatically, let's get together and let's talk about it and see how that affects the contract.
So follow up on that. You swallow estimation costs.
Yeah, a lot of the time we do. There are very few clients that'll pay you to do proper discovery. You know, you can go into an organization. I think like that's just the reality of the business. It's like, unless you have like a master service agreement with someone, or you're their agency of record or preferred vendor, if you are competing for jobs that happen only once a year, once every 2 years for an organization, you have to swallow. In my opinion, you're going to swallow those estimation costs.
Sorry, different question. How do you stay agile when you have things like I was looking through your prototype, and it seemed very high def.
Yeah.
Right, and it seems very involved for, like, you know, you have a person working on this full time for X number of days. Like, how do you do your change cycle at that point?
So what happens is that there's multiple designers who are working on it. And the first thing that we do on the project is kind of develop a loose style guide. And so that's like defining those interaction patterns, defining the grids, defining typographic systems. And that's going to allow sort of the teams to make healthy decisions about spacing pretty early on, like when they're trying to do information architecture of like their early screen views and that type of stuff. And then everything about that is sort of iterated on and going forward, and basically one designer makes a good decision and that gets adopted by all the other designers who are working on something, as they sort of do their sort of skill meeting at the in the middle of the week, or scrum meeting at the beginning of the week.
But how do you stay lean then? Because like it delves in the details, right? Like you're starting with topography first.
Maybe. I mean, like it all depends on what you're designing, right? Like you're kind of assessing what are the most important things to set up right now. And really, this design is in service of the developers very early on, and they need a lot of stuff, right? Like to sort of get going. And the trick is to start off with the base of like, these are some core elements that we're going to start off with. And then everything else is kind of, you're figuring it out as you're going along. And then you're consolidating and codifying throughout probably these weekly check-ins with the skill teams. It's not perfect Agile because design isn't perfect Agile, right? Like design is very, very subjective a lot of the times. And then two, like it's, you kind of like, you know, one of the things I hate is like, UX designers who don't work beyond the wireframe. Like human factors design is kind of what's like the old school way of thinking about like user experience, you know, and you kind of like go and you build these paper prototypes or you do all sorts of really interesting techniques. I really believe a good UX designer is a combination of skills. They have product ownership skills, product management skills. They understand the market. They have a little bit of strategy. They're a little bit of a solutions architect, right? All together in one. If you're a really super talented UX designer, when you think about the UX designers who end up going for working at Uber or Facebook or LinkedIn today, these people are really jacks of all trades. They're also willing to learn new tools. Like when a UX designer is like, I've made these wireframes, and like those wireframes get handed off to a visual designer. UX doesn't end at wireframes. Like color is so meaningful from an interaction patterns point of view, from a call to action point of view. You know, so like wireframes isn't the end of UX, right? Wireframes isn't the end of I. You know, that's the very, very beginning. That's like validating that we met some like user requirements really early on. User experience is more about how it feels, how it reacts, how things are moving, how things present to the end user at the right time. Those are all important elements of user experience design, interaction design that you know, go well beyond sort of the wireframe process.
Do you sell our clients then on the idea of completely evolving design, or like, is there ever a point where you have to have the monolithic presentation, you know, with the big printouts and
so
all that
we,
stuff that you just throw away at the end of the hour?
To be honest, when we sell things, we sell them us. We sell them like we are people capable of making good things that will hopefully win you awards and hopefully increase goals and metrics and internally driven KPIs, determined KPIs, and that there are deliverables, right? Like this style guide is an evolving document that gets more and more codified over time. And at the end of it, they have it. The second deliverable is design culture, right, and design leadership. Now that they understand how to make things and how to iterate faster, now that they know what what a makeup of a good living style guide document is, they can continue to do that internally, and they continue to update and evolve. You know, the marquee of a really great style guide, in my opinion, is the number of things it can accommodate, not the number of exceptions you have to add to it. So like that's like kind of the way we try to think about it with them. It's, you know, you now have this great tool set that you can then go and apply over and over again.
So that there is never a design presentation per se.
Oh, there are always design presentations.
So what I'm getting at is that there's one every other day or 3 times a week. There's no...
Exactly. And sometimes, you know, there's like someone really high up who doesn't touch the project very often, who then gets to see it all at once. Mm-hmm. But it's all about framing those presentations in a way where they can't just make a subjective decision. You have the product owners there being like, we're moving in this direction, we validated against these factors, we've tested it with these users. If you're going into a presentation with someone, you know, halfway through the project to assess direction, and they have the power to stop the project, you frame that presentation wrong, and you haven't engaged the right stakeholders.
Agreed. Thanks.
I'm interested in how post-launch, how does analytics play into this methodology, and how do you collaborate with your clients to find out how successful your product and your strategy was?
So at the very beginning when we started our agency, people didn't want to tell us anything. You know, like it was like, oh, you're the design team, go and make it, we're going to implement it, or you're going to build this thing, then we have it, and then we don't care about you, we paid you all the money, we're going to pay you. Now teams really want to, everyone's concerned about like validation and methodology now. So what we do is, at the beginning of the project, we're determining what the KPIs are. In the case of something like Sportsnet, users, and so user growth was extremely important, and video plays were extremely important, right? So those were 2 extremely important metrics for them to measure. They could sell the most expensive ads against their video, and 2, they could leverage the licenses they just paid a buttload of money for in their application. They wanted to validate that they were getting the most out of their media spend. So those were 2 things we really looked out for. Fortunately, we were both trending those in upward directions when the application launched. We didn't have to reassess any of those particular strategies or any of the particular tactics that guided some of the design decisions. So that's like a good thing. In other cases, we just recently finished working with Scientific American on like a continuing education platform with them. We were learning that we had metrics that were saying like doctors were not completing tests, coming back and then going and answering a bunch of other questions. So like we kind of realized what doctors were doing, which was like cheating. They were like going in, taking, like we didn't have a time limit on tests, and so they were going in, they were kind of like seeing what questions they were stumbling on, going and reading, coming back to the test, and we had like extremely short session lengths or something like that. And so we had to like kind of design a new solution for tests that kind of made it apparent to the user that we're going to track the number of times you exit this test, or like you session away from the window, so that we know if you're cheating, we're not going to give you all the credits. So yeah, don't trust your doctor. Or do trust your doctor.
Yeah, that's scary.
And you had a question?
Yeah, 2 questions. So, how sticky were your changes with the Sportsnet guys? Like you did your Spotify like methodology there, that's cool. You guys left, and then 6 months later, are they still doing that, or?
Yeah, it's actually been really great. So we came in at a perfect time, right? Like the client was really starting to embrace these practices. So we didn't have to do too much to get them on board fully. And then I would say that, you know, it's really like, I gotta hand it to them for like wanting to do that. They had a separate building, like the Rogers Media team had a separate building where they were building a lot of this stuff in, which was just a little bit further down Bloor Street. So that they had like just an entirely different culture than the rest of Rogers, right? Like they weren't walking around with other people who were, you know, running other day-to-day business at Rogers. They kind of developed their own internal culture. And that's super important, right? I think like any company wants to develop a culture that supports those processes. I think that was, you know, probably, you know, kudos to them to identify that.
Second question, how do you fold the end user and like their voice into your design process, both like early on to inform the design and then like as you're talking about with analytics, like post-launch? It's like click-throughs are great and everything, but like how do you know the actual sentiment of your users?
So there's a couple ways. You know, one, you want to have a lot of domain passion when you're going into a project like these, right? So we get to do a lot of consumer-facing sort of experiences. So having people who are really not just subject matter experts, but passionate about the subject matter working on these things is super important to us. So we have a pretty diverse design team who has a variety of different passions, and we kind of find the right people to own that particular subject matter. And then they really don't have a problem understanding the end user or being empathetic as a designer by understanding sort of user expectations. Two, this comes down to being a really good UX designer. One of the things that I look for a lot is like that UX designer's ability to learn and take a deep dive into a community, take a deep dive into a subject matter, anything, where that's what they live and breathe. That's what they really love to do. They can do the user research themselves from an anecdotal perspective, and they can see what's going on. A lot of the times it has to do with an awareness of other products that might be tangential to the space, understanding why those are successful experiences and implementing solutions that make sense in those contexts. So, like, you know, you can learn an awful lot from Facebook even though you're not building Facebook, right? So, like, making sure you're learning about best practices all the time is super important. And then three is the user personas, the research, all that stuff that usually big companies already have done. They usually have really, really deep sets of data, great marketing sort of stuff that's happening. And then we're like kind of assessing the set. Fortunately on this is a rebuild. This is something that existed and we're doing it. So we knew what the complaints were and we knew what people loved in the app, right? And so we knew if we removed the things people love, that's gonna be a no-no. And if we did the things the same, that's gonna be a no-no too, right? So like we kind of had a feeling from based on the reviews, based on the surveys, based on all that information going into the project, going into the initial design phase once we won the gig, what to do. After the fact, I think it's pretty easy sometimes to get user sentiment, especially when you're in the App Store. We're fortunate enough that this has a user base in the hundreds of thousands and that type of stuff. So like there's tweets about it, there's analytic information that we can then correlate against the actual things that are happening. So like if we're seeing, oh, this person's complaining about video views or some ad popping up all the time, you can then compare that against the data, see if that's like relevant or if this is this person's experience. There are all sorts of really great Crashlytics tools. The Apple Reporter tool's gotten really robust lately that you can really get that user feedback. And then, you know, are you driving towards those KPIs? Sometimes vocal users often aren't happy, you know, because they're vocal. There might be a lot of really happy users and kind of making that decision based on data after the fact.
Thank you.
Cool, so if there's no more questions.
One more? Or?
Oh, one super
totally.
quick one.
Yeah.
When you do your style guides, how do you document it?
How do we document it?
Yeah, like what tools do you use to document it?
So we have done several different types of style guides. Sometimes we build them on the web, so we'll like actually have a small framework that we built that's just like kind of a CMS, but it's mostly something you build from scratch. That is like just, we've done it before, so we can do it again. Those are like our living style guides. Otherwise, you know, we are building the mock-ups in either Sketch or Illustrator or Photoshop, and then we're making it documented in InDesign. But you can make it document in anything. I think the content of the style guide is like just the super important thing. It doesn't matter what format it's in.
All good? Cool, thank you so much, Dave.
So there is a little bit of an overlap between what I'm going to talk today and the AgileXD Meetup talk from last week, so I apologize for that, but those of you who were there, there's new stuff. So let's just dive into it. So I'm just going to talk about a slightly different, maybe better approach to CSS. And it's made up of 3 core things. The first one is using a type scale. The second is to use a white space scale. And then the third one is using utility classes, and just a lot of utility classes. And I'll go into about like what I mean by each one of those. So with the type scale, it's pretty straightforward. I'm assuming most projects use this here. If not, then definitely should start doing it. And the idea is pretty simple. You go to one of those tools, pick a type scale. It's all mathematically calculated. You don't really have to do any thinking. The only choice you have to make is whether there's font sizes that drastically change between in your app, or if they're kind of tightly sized so that there's not a lot of variation. So you just want slight variation. So based on that, you pick one of these scales. But the more important part is you stick to only these font sizes. And in most cases, I found that you need only 6 font sizes to build out anything. If you're using more than 6 font sizes, then generally doing something wrong. And that'll lead to a bit about the utility classes later. But the idea is you pick 6 font sizes and just stick to that in the CSS.
Can you touch on the rationale behind the recommendation?
For the font sizes?
Just in general.
The rationale behind this? Like all the suggestions?
Oh,
Or just the type scale?
It's helpful for me, at least, because I'm a bit of a rebel, to understand the reason why rules are there.
I will get into that.
Okay,
the point is for it to make sense.
What's that?
The point is for it to be orderly.
Yeah,
So
if it makes sense, then
scales help with that.
The same thing applies to white space. And by white space, I mean stuff like margins and padding and a lot of helpers that help you align content. And we've been doing this on a lot of projects. We've been using base spacing variable, and then all the margins and paddings that are in our CSS are usually multiples of that. And that kind of came out of the Google design spec, and just designing stuff that's based on actual grids. But beyond that, what I've kind of discovered is you can get away with just a simple white space scale of 0.5 rem, 1 rem, 2 rem, and 4 rem. And all of your margins and paddings will just use those values, and that's it. And that tends to be enough to build out anything. Again, depending on what you're doing, you might want to introduce more values there. But this is sort of a good base to get started with, and not have to worry about how to construct a layout in a very complex manner. And then finally, utility classes. So this is something that it took me a while to get into, just because it's object-oriented CSS, and you end up with a lot of classes in your markup. But thanks to looking at the source code for base CSS, I've kind of gotten around that issue, and this also helped solidify why we should be doing that. So Google released some metrics for what people actually do with CSS. So most of the rules that people apply are display related, layout related. So positioning stuff, the font sizes, margin, padding, and colors. So that's basically like 75% of the CSS that you're actually applying. Why do you keep rewriting that every single time in components? So instead, you pull them out as utility classes and use them across the project. And that means basically you build immutable utilities, by which I mean that these utilities are basically single-purpose classes that form the backbone for typography, layout, and then some core visual styles. And they're immutable because once they're set, they should not be changed or extended. And they should only be limited to 1 or 2 styles. And this is something from the base CSS design principles. So the utility should do one thing and do it well. It should be simple, obvious to use, and they should operate independently. So this is kind of the core of what your utility should be. When you pick a type scale, that means you have like 6 to 8 font sizes. I would limit it to 6. You assign 6 classes. So the pattern I've been using a lot is just use H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, H6. And those are your 6 font sizes, and you can just apply that directly to a DOM node and not have to worry about, I need to build a component and then just simply set a font size on that component. The same thing goes for white space, but with white space, you can kind of do some pretty smart things. So this is the naming convention that base CSS uses, and a couple of other frameworks I've noticed. So you use a shorthand. So let's say M stands for margin. You combine it with your scale. So M0 would set margin 0. M1 would set margin to your first value. So in this case, 0.5 rem. But then also you can do directionally. So ML1 would set margin left 1, MR1, margin right 1. The same idea applies for padding. And then X and Y means providing symmetry. So if you set MX1, you're setting margin left and right both at the same time. And really these classes in themselves take away, I would say, about 50% of the CSS that we write here. The other thing is for colors. So again, font color and background color. It's a pretty common thing that you have to apply, and I've seen a lot of people write components and just literally set font color and font size. So again, if you turn that into a utility, you don't have to worry about building out all of these components. Same thing for borders. And then lastly, layout. So for layout, this is like a very minimal framework called Graviton that does all of those, does the font size utilities, the margin and padding utilities, and then they have a bunch of layout utilities. So even stuff like setting things to display block, display inline block, or float left, float right, clear float, and then a very basic grid system with 12 columns. So Black Crows was a really good example of this, where they were building their main page layout, the landing page, and they built it out as a bunch of components. And when you actually went and looked at the code, really all it was a grid system, and they needed 0 components and could have just done the entire page just by layouts. So eventually they ended up bringing in a layout class from Flex, like the Flex object library, right? And then everything was just built using that. And then the same idea can be extended to animations, but that tends to be a little bit harder. You can set up few core animation classes, but animation tends to be really tied to the component you're building. So that's kind of up for discussion. And so these are not my original ideas. They kind of came out of following 3 people, Adam Rose, Nicole Sullivan, and Brent Jackson. Between them, they're maintaining base CSS, gravitons, tachyons, and then Nicole Sullivan does a lot of consulting for writing CSS for massive apps and enterprise apps. So they came up with the idea of like a mixture of component and object-oriented CSS, and that's kind of what I've been playing around with. And I've used this approach on Opus 1, and it turned out pretty nice. We only have, I think, 25 lines of CSS in that project. So going back to components which we use right now. So initially when we started doing components for CSS, we were still writing apps the old way with Angular. So we weren't really breaking up the app into components, but now we're doing that. And we're building these components that are independent and self-sufficient. But the problem that I've noticed is people end up applying CSS to that components when, or like building out CSS components when it's not really necessary. So let the JavaScript drive the components and apply as much styles as you can apply with the utility classes. And if you get to a point where enough stuff is happening and you notice a pattern, that's when you build out a component. So you kind of limit yourself to how many components you build. And if you build a component, it should be responsive by default, but also it should expand to fit its parent. It should always be 100% width. And then still the layout and the core styling should come from utility classes. So you're writing really less amount of CSS. These are 3 frameworks that I mentioned. They're all written using this approach. So if you are curious about how to do this, I would recommend reading through their source, and they're pretty easy to read through.
SAS frameworks?
They're not. They're written using PostCSS, and I'll get into what PostCSS is, or just pure CSS actually. So Bash CSS is actually pretty cool because the entire framework is split into node modules. So you don't have to pull in the entire framework. You can pull in just one part of the framework that you like, and that's what they did on Black Crows, and it works out really nicely.
I mean, it's like, I don't know, 12 lines of CSS or something.
Yeah.
At least a module.
So what this lets us do is write less CSS and iterate faster, because you have all of these building blocks already. You can actually prototype in code really fast and not have to worry about, I'm going to try out 2 different UI components, but then I have to build out 2 different UI components. With this, you have pretty much everything you need to build out most things. So I'll pull another example. This came up on the Shape Security analytics dashboard, and I don't mean to pick on them. It was just a really good example. So when Claudia was working on this and she first built it out, the general approach here tends to be with our BEM syntax and component style would be to break it up into the header bar component up top, and then the header bar would have a title section to it, a title element to it, and an action element to it. And then the main body would be the card component. The card would have, again, a body and a figure. And then you write out all the CSS for it. But if you actually go back to it and use the utility approach, the header here is just using flex utilities. So you don't actually need anything to build out the layout. The font sizing comes from font size utilities. You go to the card, it has border. The border comes from border utilities. The layout comes from layout utilities. The list styling comes from the main list style utility. And then this image size comes from layout utility. So pretty much you can actually build out this entire thing using utilities and not have a single component inside your code base. So like I mentioned, it ends up being a bit like CSS Lego, where you have.
Sorry, one of the reasons that people gravitate towards the BEM approach is that it's sort of the styles that you're putting in your HTML are semantic instead of actually dictating the details of the appearance. And so isn't this just moving in the opposite direction?
So it's that part's kind of tricky. So the problem ends up being is when you attach visual styles to a component, those visual styles are still driven by the core style that you pick for your app. So if you go and change your font to a different font, suddenly now all of these sizes have to change, and now you have to go and change all of these elements. Whereas if you pick a base font size class, that class, if it updates, it doesn't really matter because the way it's being used is still the same.
So is the argument that the sort of semantic thing that says this is functionally a header or this is functionally the graph, that happens now by splitting up templates?
Exactly. Yeah, and then so
having like styling details like ingrained in your templates is not a problem, but it used to.
Yeah, this is actually like pretty close to writing inline styles. Yeah. The only thing is you don't have inline styles everywhere. So with this, you're kind of writing inline styles because each class is just one rule at a time.
Okay. It's more controlled kind of inline style.
Yeah.
But it's also a matter of like, what would you rather have, a really fast, lightweight CSS or, super verbose semantic CSS, right? And then like how semantic is that BEM naming convention you know, when it's like, you know, when you get to like, you know, three strings of it deep. I don't know. I think it's more of a philosophical argument around the semantics of CSS classes than anything else. It's not really, I don't think it has any inherent kind of.
I mean, it's easier to maintain this approach because you just write less CSS. So that's one positive aspect there.
I think I answered my own question in a sense. I think there's value in components, but we're not doing components in CSS. We're already doing components by splitting up our templates or using JSX.
Yeah.
But I guess this approach then would be recommended for that specific situation in the sense that if you're kind of doing massive templates, then you would want to have sort of them to complement to.
Well, you shouldn't be doing massive templates.
No, see, but if you were to be doing massive templates, then them could sort of like hold you up. To give you a little bit of structure. But if we actually split it into small JavaScript components, then we don't necessarily need to duplicate the same semantics in CSS, and instead.
Yeah, instead you can rely on the actual component that you build out. Yeah. Yeah, which is the same argument for inline styles, because you're now not writing inline styles several times now.
Is this approach mainly meant to be used in React?
No, across the board.
Okay, because in my past job, actually, they had a similar system to this in place, and it actually got to become a bit of a nuisance because anytime you want to like change a button, you have to go and change it. You'll find that the buttons all throughout the app.
But that's where we can rely on building out that button component and then reuse it. So you only have that template once, and you don't have to build out that button HTML multiple times. If you're building it out multiple times, then that's an argument for making it a simple like ng-include type component even.
Yeah, I think that's what we work on.
So yeah, like I mentioned, I think this kind of came up already. It really helps with scalability because you're writing single-purpose classes, so it's really easy to understand. It's easy to reason about cascading. You're not worried about is this class inheriting any style from a parent? If you're applying a class, it's directly applied to where it should style something. So you can almost be guaranteed that it's going to work, and you don't have fear of impact. So we inherit a lot of client projects where we're hesitant to go in and change any CSS because we have no idea what changing this one variable would mean for anything else that's inside that code base. And really, like, it just helps with getting in, updating style, and getting out, and not spending too much time about reasoning why this style isn't working and what kind of selector I need to use to get this to work. So the other thing I wanted to talk about was post-CSS. How many people here have actually heard of post-CSS? Okay. So post-CSS is really two things. One, it's an API for transforming CSS styles with JavaScript. And the other is that post-CSS has a really rich plugin ecosystem. You can kind of think of it as Gulp for CSS. So you had a question?
No.
Oh, okay.
Look at my hair. I saw my hand go up.
So these are a few examples of post-CSS plugins. So Auto Prefixer, which adds vendor prefixes. CSS Nano just optimizes CSS for production. CSS Next lets you use CSS4 spec syntax. So it's kind of like Babel.js for CSS. And then StyleLint, which does linting for style sheets. And then there's a whole bunch of other things you can do, like get involved into future CSS syntax, use fallbacks, language extensions, color functions, optimizations. There's even a Sass plugin for post-CSS. So if you really like the Sass syntax, you can use that to write Sass styles with post-CSS. And using it is pretty simple. It's a node module. You require the node module, and then you specify all of the plugins that you want to run in order, and then source your CSS and give a destination file, and you can set a few options like source maps. There's Gulp plugins that let you write the same thing just faster. There's Webpack post-CSS loaders, so you can actually use it in Webpack, and it's much faster to use in Webpack.
Dot process CSS. What's a CSS variable?
That's the CSS that you're loading up. So this is like just using raw post CSS, but if you're using with Gulp, that would be just piping the CSS from your source into it. Yeah, so if you're actually interested in using it, then I would recommend using either the Gulp plugin or the Webpack loader. And then there's also something called immutable CSS, which is a CSS linter for immutable selectors. It's actually written in PostCSS, so you can use it as a PostCSS plugin, but it's also available as its own node module if you want to use it. So what this does is basically ensures that if you're importing CSS from a third-party library, you're not modifying it ever, which means basically you can never use Bootstrap or Ionic. So obviously you wouldn't be using it if you're using Bootstrap or Ionic, but for most, I would say now, modern CSS frameworks, this actually helps a lot. And the other thing it does is it ensures that if you used a selector once in your code base, you're not overwriting it somewhere else. So I'll give a quick example of that. So their website, you can go and test it out with a bunch of popular CSS libraries. It's set up to work with base CSS. So what you do is you load up your CSS framework that you're using and then compare it against the CSS styles that you're writing yourself. So on the right are the styles that you're writing yourself. So there's a red class that's already defined in the framework, and then you're going in and overwriting the red class that's inside your custom CSS. And then when you run the linter, it'll actually just complain and say that that selector was used once already, so you should not be using it again. So that's a really good way to make sure that you're not overwriting styles that you shouldn't be, and you're using third-party styles the way they're meant to be used. Again, if you're loading a library, you can still customize it using variables, and then run that comparison of the compiled version of that library versus the styles you're writing, and not the raw version, because that's a valid use case. So what this would mean is that our future stack could look something like this, where we switch from Sass to CSS Next. Bourbon gets replaced by auto prefixer, because really all we do with Bourbon is just provide prefixes.
The same thing as post CSS?
I'll show what CSS Next is in a sec.
Okay.
We can replace Bootstrap with base CSS, and then the big question mark right now is what to use for linting. So there's style lint and post CSS BEM linter, and a combination of them kind of replaces SCSS lint. But the last time I tried it out, it was kind of janky and didn't quite work as expected. So that's one of the reasons why we haven't really jumped into post CSS yet. I think the community needs, the plugin environment kind of needs to mature a little bit more, and they need to pick out things that are well maintained and almost have like a whitelisted version of plugins. But it's good enough that a lot of people are using it already. And then the last part is immutable CSS, which is kind of an optional thing. If you're interested, you can try and use that in your project. So CSS Next is just a post CSS plugin that lets you write CSS4 syntax for right now. So again, it's basically like Babel for CSS. So CSS4 has variables. You have to declare them in a root declaration, I guess. You can have custom media queries, calculation on the fly, and then there's a bunch of other things. But that basically gives us most of the things we use from Sass.
Is it better than Sass? Like, so what's the motivation for moving from Sass to?
So with Sass, you're kind of limited to what Sass provides you. Whereas with this, you can use, if you like the Sass syntax, you can still use the Sass syntax, but then bring in more plugins to help yourself out. Whereas with Sass, you're kind of limited to go at their pace. And then also, Sass I would compare to as like what Sass is kind of like CoffeeScript to JavaScript, whereas CSS Next is basically you're writing ES6 instead of ES5.
So,
quick question about CSS here. I didn't see this colon root selector.
Yes.
Someone colon post.
I have no idea, but it's just part of the new syntax. So if you're declaring variables, they have to go inside a root element. And that's everything I had, actually. So any questions?
So a while back, I was playing with Polymer, and Polymer kind of touches on some of these concepts because it's a component-oriented library, and the way they handle CSS and styling is internal to the component. So they'll have an internal style sheet into each component, and it's really kind of those styles don't look above themselves. Like everything from the top component down inward, and it talks about this like whole isolationist like componentized styling system. A lot of what they rely on in that are, well, CSS4 or not quite ready CSS selectors.
Mm-hmm.
The one I mentioned is :host, which looks at the host shadow DOM components, and that would be like the parent.
Yeah.
My question basically is, when it comes to writing componentized, like JavaScript and HTML and templates, all that stuff, and now apparently CSS. Is there any sort of unifying theory in terms of how to write this? Should we have like a folder for components? Inside each folder have a style sheet, have JavaScript, have an HTML, and should this style sheet and HTML and JavaScript only care about itself and nothing else?
Yeah, that's kind of the approach we've taken on a few projects now. Uniqlo is written exactly like that. The downside of that is there's still a bunch of core styling that you want to share across all of these components.
Yeah.
And that's where Webpack actually is really awesome, because you can require CSS style sheets inside a component. Just you import them, and then that they're available to you, and you can apply them as inline styles or as classes. So you can still maintain those core styles in one place and share them across multiple components, but they end up being applied as inline styles.
So basically, the tools that you're talking about really kind of highlight this path towards. I mean, because I've noticed we've done JavaScript very componentized and very like separation and concern oriented, even HTML and templates. I guess this is kind of doing the same with CSS.
Yeah, but at the same time, like
you still have that like
having that core layer of utilities and not trying to write too much inside components.
So was this structured in the DOM when you, I guess, the outline? Was it structured in the DOM, and how does the CSS get applied? I guess are they kind of generated as inline styles in CSS? Are they classes that get like you may have a BEM syntax on a pairing component that scopes them? Like how does it work?
So the utilities themselves are just classes, so you apply them in the class attribute. For inline styles, depends on what library you use. With React, you kind of just say, this is my inline style object, and they just get applied on the style attribute. And then for BEM syntax, again, it's just a class. So if you're mixing BEM syntax and the utilities, you end up having both utilities and BEM syntax applied to the same DOM node, but you wouldn't have too many BEM classes, just a handful of them.
What's the build speed like on this CSS Next? What's it called?
Pretty decent, I guess. I don't know. I haven't done any comparison between Gulp.
I mean, when you have a whole bunch of CSS.
Yeah, I mean, it's fine. It's not like it takes a few seconds. It's pretty comparable to what we do with Gulp.
Another question. So this is maybe more general than just CSS. This is, again, back to component-oriented development. One thing I've been playing with Angular 2 a little bit. One thing I've noticed is that I'm much more comfortable writing all the templating in my JS file, because all my components are probably like 2-3 lines in templates, because they're all small and they're all like, interactive. So they're all like pluggable. They can plug the other components. So running a separate template file for this and having all my HTML into like a separate like that HTML file that's like 4 lines long seems unnecessary. This sounds like this might be the same bit of mental unnecessity, I guess you could say. That's completely random what you said there, but I mean, what I'm trying to say is having a separate style sheet outside my component, my JS file. I'm gonna have like 3 lines of, like you mentioned, like very few CSS lines in my JS file, right next to my template file, right next to my JavaScript file. it sounds appealing to me. Is that something you think?
That's basically inline styles. There's libraries for that in React. I haven't seen much in Angular. With templates, you can use backticks and write out a template pretty easily.
Yeah.
You can't really do something similar with CSS. I mean, you can use ng style, which would be kind of inline styles for Angular, but we haven't really talked about that as a company yet.
Oh, and did that answer your questions about the rules around?
Oh, the why.
Oh, yeah. So if you want to get more into the why, Base CSS actually has a design principles section on their site that actually talks about why to write CSS like that, which goes into a lot more detail. I would recommend that. And then they also have a section about UI elements, so how you would build UI elements that you get from Bootstrap, but using only utility classes.
For utility, I could definitely kind of derive the why. I guess I get wary of rules because you put form over function, you can get tied up following rules and not really think about what the problem you're actually solving. So I'm usually wary of that. So it sounds like a really, really good default, and the special case then you can kind of navigate.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of our approach to everything at Rangle, I would say.
I think around typography, it's like mostly people make them up as they go. So from a typographic scale, I mean the point is to have variance between the different scales, right?
Yeah. Like there's certain, like this is an edge case, but sometimes if you considering accessibility as like a primary concern, tools like JAWS provide ways for you to navigate through lists by headings, but they don't by list items because it's just like too crazy. So you have within a LI like H3s, for example, as your title attribute. If that gets styled in the same like H3 style that you're using in like an article, like it just doesn't work, right? So there's a bunch of like special case when you're thinking about the problem you're solving that you probably need to like consider, but as a good default, it makes sense.
Sure.
Another of my main questions. So I saw something a little while ago that I think kind of ties into something you showed earlier, and this ties into the header thing and typography thing. So I've seen this a few times where somebody will take all the H tags and wipe all the styles, completely make them blank, and then give them each their own individual styles. And this will tie into, I guess, their individual typography sizes and widths and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
The reason for this is, as best I can understand, is kind of to do with accessibility. It's because there are all these like embedded tools that expect H1s to be at a certain place because they're the header. And mentally and visually, when we see HTML, we expect H1s to be there. So just having like a span with a header one class is not semantic, or at least not useful.
Right.
Would you recommend that practice?
Yeah, they do that a lot with base CSS. So you can actually have an H1 with an H4 class applied to it, so it would have the size of an H4, but it would still be semantically an H1, or apply H4 to a paragraph tag if you want it to be larger and things like that. So that's totally acceptable.
So you would say all the H's, maybe P's, all these should be, not should be, but could be.
Oh, anything could be any size. That's the whole point. You're making those utilities so that you can apply it wherever you want to. Right. Thank you.